He was the most powerful man in Boston. He controlled more than most people will ever know. And he threw away a 10-year marriage, not because of a war, not because of a rival, but because of a woman he had carried in his memory since they were kids on the same broken sidewalk in South Boston. He thought that was the greatest thing he had ever done. He thought she would understand. She did understand. She understood so clearly that within 24 hours, she accepted a dinner date, signed a contract to move to another state, and never once looked back. No tears, no confrontation, no dramatic speech, just a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and refused to become someone else's reason. What Dominic Reyes did not expect was that her walking away would be the thing that finally changed him. Not his enemies, not his losses, her silence. This is not a story about crime. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful person in the room turns out to be the one who needs nothing from you. This channel is about mafia boss stories, but not the kind you think. Some people are born to lead. Some lessons no classroom will ever teach you. Only the ones who have held real power know what it actually costs. This channel does not tell stories about criminals. This channel tells stories about mindset, about backbone, and about the hidden truths behind real power. What this story gives you is something you can carry into your own life. The lesson is this: the moment you stop needing someone's approval, you become the most dangerous person in the room. Camila Santos never raised her voice. She never demanded anything. She simply lived by her own standard, and that standard was the one thing Dominic Reyes could not outmaneuver, outspend, or outlast. Real strength is not about what you can force to happen. It is about what you refuse to accept. If this story made you think, do something for yourself right now. Hit like so. More people find it. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about power, mindset, and the lessons only the strongest people learn, subscribe and stay close. The next story is already coming.
There are mornings when life changes not because something happens to you directly, but because something happens somewhere far away, and someone decides you need to know about it. That Tuesday morning in August was one of those mornings. I was eating oatmeal in the hospital break room at 6 in the morning, coffee still too hot to drink, the kind of quiet that only exists before the day really starts. And then my phone rang. It was Nora, my colleague, my best friend, the only person I know who calls before sunrise without apologizing for it. I answered before I even looked at the screen. Nora said, "Mila, Dominic Reyes just got divorced." I drank my coffee, set the cup down, and I said, "Okay, all right." The problem was, it was not all right at all. Let me tell you who Dominic Reyes is. Not the version people read about in newspapers. The version I carry in my memory. The one that lives somewhere between a South Boston summer and a street corner I haven't stood on in over 20 years. We grew up 3 houses apart. Same block, same cracked sidewalks, same corner store where you could buy a soda for $1 and sit on the stoop for an hour without anyone bothering you. When I was 10, he was 15. When I was 16, he was 21. And then one day he wasn't there anymore. He disappeared the way young men in South Boston tend to disappear. Quietly, without ceremony. And everyone in the neighborhood pretended not to know where they went. I went to college on a scholarship, then medical school, then 8 years in New York, 3 years in London, and 3 months ago, back to Boston. Not for him. For my mother, who had just started chemotherapy. In all those years, his name surfaced occasionally. On the news. In overheard conversations. In the way people went quiet when certain topics came up. I knew he had become something. I deliberately chose not to find out exactly what, and now Nora was calling at 6 in the morning. People are saying he left his wife because of you, Nora said. I could hear her scrolling through her phone while she talked. I said, people are saying that based on what? Nora said, based on the fact that he lived with his wife for 10 years without doing anything, and you've been back in Boston for 3 months. I looked at my coffee. The surface was perfectly still. I said, that is speculation, not evidence. Nora said, Mila. I said, I have a 7 a.m. patient. I have to go. I ended the call. Stared at my phone for a moment. Then I put it in my pocket and walked back to work. But I could not turn my brain off. Here is what I knew about Dominic Reyes and his marriage. Not from him. From Isabella Moretti Reyes herself, who I would meet weeks later and whose version I have come to trust most. Dominic and Isabella married on an October afternoon 10 years ago. No large wedding. A small ceremony with the people who needed to be there. No honeymoon. He flew to Chicago the next morning. She went to Napa Valley with her friends. That was how it started. And those 10 years were not terrible. No violence, no betrayal, no screaming matches. They appeared together at the events that required a united front. They had dinner every Sunday. They respected each other's space with the courtesy of two people who both understood what the arrangement was. Isabella knew from the first day that he did not love her. He was polite and attentive and completely absent in the way that matters most. She accepted that. Not because she was weak, because she was practical, and because in the world she came from, that kind of marriage was not unusual. But when Dominic walked into her office one July evening and placed an envelope on her desk, Isabella looked at him for a long time without speaking. She said, "She's back in Boston." Dominic said nothing. Isabella said, "Camila Santos." She said it like reading a name from a list. "I've known that name since our second year together. You never said it once, but when you couldn't sleep, I always knew what you were thinking about." Dominic said, "Isabella." She said, "Don't apologize. I don't want your apology. Just answer one question honestly. Were you ever really here? In all those 10 years?" He looked at the woman who had lived alongside him for a decade, and for the first time in 10 years, he actually looked at her. He said, "No, not enough." Isabella nodded, picked up the envelope, said, "At least you're honest. Sign what needs to be signed. I'll call my attorney in the morning." That was how the marriage ended. Not with a crash, not with tears, with 2 words and an envelope being lifted off a desk. Back at the hospital, I was finishing rounds when one of my longtime patients, a retired attorney named Mr. Callahan, called me into his room and closed the door. He said, "Dr. Santos, I don't know your connection to Dominic Reyes, and I'm not asking, but as someone who owes you their life, I want you to know. Your name is being spoken in circles where you don't want your name to appear." I sat across from him. I said, "I know. Thank you." He said, "Victor Salazar heard about the divorce this morning. He will see it as an opportunity." I asked, "Who is Salazar?" Mr. Callahan looked at me. He said, "The man Dominic Reyes has kept from climbing for 15 years. The man who now, with the Reyes-Moretti alliance broken, has nothing stopping him." I thanked him and walked out. In the hallway, I stopped at a window looking down into the courtyard. August in Boston. Green trees. People walking below. Perfectly normal. Dominic Reyes had filed for divorce because of me. He had not asked me first. He had not told me it was coming. He had simply decided. And now my name was moving through dangerous circles because of his decision. I looked at my phone. There was a message from an unfamiliar number. It said, "Dr. Santos, we need to talk. Dr." I read it 3 times. Then I locked my phone and put it away. That evening, I did 2 things. First, I called Marco Silva back. Marco was a businessman who had been asking me to dinner, politely and persistently, for 6 months. Every time before, I had said no. This time I said, "Thursday night, does that work?" He said, "Absolutely." Second, I opened the email from the Mayo Clinic that had been sitting in my inbox for 3 weeks. Chief of Neurosurgery, Rochester, Minnesota. The best research opportunity in the country for my field. I had said no 3 times before. I always told myself I was not ready to leave Boston. I started typing. Dear Dr. Harrison, I would like to formally accept this position, effective 90 days from today. Please send the contract at your earliest convenience. Dr. Camila Santos. I hit send, closed the laptop, and I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the ceiling of my Boston apartment, thinking, this is not running away. This is a decision I have been putting off for reasons that were never good enough. Now I had a good enough reason. Thursday evening, Marco Silva arrived exactly on time. He was wearing a navy blazer and dark jeans, the kind of thing a man wears when he is comfortable with himself. He stood when I walked in. Just natural politeness, nothing performed. He said, I have to be honest. I didn't expect you to call back. Not in a bad way. You'd said no a fair number of times. I said, I was busy. He said, I know, but everyone in Boston is busy. People still eat dinner. I looked at him the way I look at everyone. 15 years in operating rooms train you to read people quickly. What I saw, eye contact that didn't dodge, no attempt to steer the conversation toward where he already planned to go. He asked about my work and genuinely listened, not waiting for his turn, actually listening. He is decent, I thought. Not perfect, genuinely decent. And that night, decent was exactly what I needed. We talked for 2 hours about medicine and architecture, about Boston in August and why this city is beautiful even when it is difficult, about books. He was rereading Marcus Aurelius. I was working through a dense paper on neuroplasticity. When we said goodbye outside, he did not suggest continuing the night. He just said, this was genuinely good, Camilla. I hope the next time is not another 6 months. I said, it won't be. He nodded, raised his hand, and walked to his car. I stood on the sidewalk and felt something I could not immediately name. Not happiness, not relief, closer to normal, like I had briefly remembered who I was outside of all the noise. My phone buzzed. Nora. Where are you? I texted back, just finished dinner, she replied, with Marco? I said yes. She said, you doing okay? I looked at my phone for a moment. Then I typed, actually okay, really. Back home, I sat at my desk and did something I rarely do. I made 2 lists. The first list, reasons to engage with what Dominic started. The second list, reasons not to. Then I stared at both lists and realized I had already made the decision before I wrote a single word. People do not make lists for decisions they are still considering. They make lists for decisions they have already arrived at but are not ready to admit. Here was the truth I was not ready to admit. I was afraid. Not of Dominic, of myself. Afraid of the part of me that still remembered him, that still carried that South Boston corner in some quiet corner of my chest. Afraid that if I stayed in Boston without a clear reason to create distance, I might make decisions based on memory instead of reality. I have worked too hard to be the woman who acts from memory instead of clarity. So, Mayo Clinic. So, Marco. Not running away, moving forward. There is a real difference. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered. I said, I won't be talking to you tonight. No need to ask who was calling. The voice was deep and even. Nothing unnecessary in it. Dominic said, I know. I just wanted you to know that I understand why you're doing what you're doing. I said, you don't understand anything. A brief pause. He said, maybe, but I know enough to know that I didn't ask you first, and that was wrong. I said, that is not an apology. That is an observation. He said, do you want an apology? I said, I want you to stop calling tonight. 1 second. He said, all right. He ended the call. I put the phone on my desk, stood up and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. He stopped when I asked. No argument, no addition. I noted that. I did not know what to do with it yet. That same night, across the city, Dominic's half-brother Raphael found him in his office at D Street. Rafe is 29, looks like a lighter version of Dominic, the same bone structure but with a smile that runs too wide for any room it enters. He dropped into the chair across from Dominic without being invited. Standard operating procedure for him. Rafe said, "She hung up?" Dominic said, "I did." Rafe said, "You hung up?" Dominic said, "She asked me to." Rafe studied his brother for a long moment. Then he said, "That is the first time you have done what someone asked you to in as long as I can remember." Dominic said, "Rafe?" Rafe said, "Just noting it." Dominic stood, went to the window, looked out at Boston at night. He said, "I was wrong." Rafe said, "About what specifically?" "Because you were wrong about several things tonight." Dominic said, "I made a decision without asking her. I put her name in my story. I thought she would understand, or feel grateful, or—" He stopped. Rafe finished it. He said, "Or wait for you." Dominic said, "Yes." Rafe said, "And she didn't wait." Dominic said, "No." They sat with that for a moment. Then Rafe said, "You know what's interesting? This is the first time someone didn't do what you expected, and you respect them for it." Dominic didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Rafe asked, "What is the move?" Dominic said, "I don't know yet." Rafe said, "First time you've said that to me." Dominic said, "First time I genuinely mean it." Rafe left with the small, real smile of someone who had just witnessed something he'd been waiting a long time to see. The following Monday morning, I was walking from the clinic to the department meeting when I saw him. Not tucked in a waiting area, not in a corner. Dominic Reyes was standing directly in the middle of a Boston General Hospital corridor, in a dark suit without a single wrinkle, looking completely out of place in the specific way that absolute calm always looks wrong somewhere people are rushing. Two nurses glanced at him as they passed. A medical student walked into a supply cart because he stopped watching where he was going. I stopped 3 meters away. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "I am working." He said, "I know. I have been here for 2 hours." 2 hours? I read him the way I read everyone. I did not see manipulation. I did not see calculation. I saw a 44-year-old man who had been standing in a hospital corridor for 2 full hours because there was no other way to reach a person who had decided not to be reachable. That is not something he normally does, I understood. Dominic Reyes does not wait for anyone. Not anywhere. I looked at my watch. I said, 15 minutes. Empty room down the hall. Inside the small conference room with the door closed, I stayed near the door. I did not sit. I did. He said, "There is no way to say this without sounding like I am making excuses, so I will not make excuses. I just want to explain." I said, "Explaining and excusing are sometimes the same thing." He said, "Not in this case." He looked at me directly. "I did not marry Isabella out of love. She knew that. I knew that. When I decided to end it, I decided because I had been living inside something dishonest for too long. You are the reason I saw that clearly. You are not the reason I did what I did. There is a difference." I looked at him. "That difference matters to you, but in the real world, my name is moving through circles I never chose to enter because of your decision." He said, "I know." I said, "You knew and you did it anyway." He started to say my name. I cut him off. "What did you think would happen?" And for the first time, my voice was not completely level. "You thought I would hear the news and feel grateful? That I would wait for you to call?" He said, "I did not think far enough ahead." And the honesty of that answer was startling. Completely flat. No defense attached to it. I said, "No, that is the problem." Then I said the thing I had been forming for days. "Dominic, I remember you from when we were kids. I remember the way you used to stand on that corner and look down the street like you could see something further out than what was actually there. I was 16, and I thought that was beautiful. But I am 38 years old now, and I see something different. You look ahead in the direction you choose, and the people around you are part of the landscape. You do not ask them if they want to be in it. He said, "You're saying I'm selfish." I said, "I am saying you are accustomed to making decisions without consulting the people those decisions affect. That works when you are running an empire. It does not work with human beings." He went still. The real kind of still, not performed. He was actually listening. I said, "I need you to leave this hospital. Not because I am afraid of you, because your presence creates risk for my patients and my colleagues. I will not allow that." He said, "All right." He stood. "But you know I will reach out again." I said, "Next time, text first. Do not appear where I work." He said, "All right." He left. I stood alone in that room and stared at the closed door. He accepted my conditions. No pushback, no additions. That was the second time in a week he had done what I asked. I filed that away and went back to work. The next day, Rafe found me. I was at my corner table in a coffee shop near the hospital, headphones on, making it clear I was not available. Rafe sat down across from me without being invited. Standard operating procedure, apparently genetic in the Reyes family. I said, "I did not invite you to sit." He said, "I know. My brother didn't send me, for the record. I didn't tell him I was coming." I said, "Then why are you here?" He said, "Victor Salazar is getting ready to move. Not against my brother directly, he never moves directly. He goes through the people connected to my brother, and right now your name is the most visible name on that list." I said, "That is your brother's problem." Rafe said, "You are absolutely right, which is exactly why I am telling you directly instead of letting my brother decide how to handle it." He had a point, and he knew I could see it. I asked, "How dangerous is Salazar to me specifically?" Rafe said, "He does not know you are planning to leave Boston. When he finds out, he will want to move before you go." I said, "I am not a chess piece for your brother to use against anyone." Rafe said, "No, but Salazar doesn't know that, and that is the problem." I drank my coffee. I asked, "Why are you telling me this instead of your brother?" Rafe said, "Because my brother would decide to protect you in whatever way he thinks is best, without asking you first. You and I have just agreed that is his fundamental problem." He stood to leave. Then he paused. He said, "One more thing. Just so you know, I have never seen my brother stand in a hospital hallway for 2 hours waiting to see someone. Not in my entire life." He left without looking back. I looked at my untouched coffee for a long time. That same week, I made a quiet decision. I looked into Salazar myself. Not like a detective, like a doctor. I read, I compared sources, I looked for patterns. What I found was not comforting. Victor Salazar was a philanthropic donor to 3 major hospitals in the Northeast, including Boston General. No criminal record, quoted in business publications for healthcare contributions. He looked completely legitimate. That worried me more than if he had looked dangerous. I found something else. The Salazar Foundation had signed a new grant agreement with Boston General 3 weeks ago. He had a legal reason to be in my hospital at any time. I texted Dominic. "The Salazar Foundation has a grant agreement with my hospital. What does that mean in the current situation?" His reply came in 2 minutes. "It means he has legal access to pharmaceutical supply chain data and physician scheduling. I can explain more. When can we meet?" I replied, "Friday, 6 p.m. You pick a neutral location." He came back quickly. "Coffee at Flower Bakery on Tremont. Public enough, busy enough to be private." He understood I wanted neutral ground. He did not push back. Again, no pushback. I put my phone down and looked out my window. Something was shifting. I was not sure yet what it meant. I did not expect Isabella Moretti to contact me, but on Wednesday morning, the front desk told me a woman had come to the hospital and left her name and a single line. The line said, "I only want to talk. I am not here to fight." The name was Isabella Moretti Reyes. I sat in my office for 10 minutes before calling her back. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was clear and measured and had nothing performed in it. She said, "Dr. Santos, thank you for calling back." I said, "What is it you want?" She said, "I want to meet once. You choose the place and the time. I have no agenda. I genuinely mean that." I said, "What are you going to say?" She said, "Things that Dominic will not tell you. Not because he is a bad person, because he does not realize he needs to say them." I looked out my office window for a long moment. Then I said, "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the Thinking Cup on Tremont Street." She said, "I will be there." Isabella Moretti at 41 looked nothing like what I had imagined. And I will admit that I had imagined something, even while telling myself I had not. She did not look abandoned. She did not look like someone who had come to make my life difficult. She looked like a woman arriving for an early morning meeting. A structured jacket, coffee already ordered when I walked in, phone face down on the table. She stood when I entered, just a nod, no handshake. She said, "Thank you for coming." I sat down. I said, "You seem more composed than I expected." She said, "How did you expect me to seem?" I said, "Angrier." She gave a small, dry smile. Not warmth, exactly. The recognition of honesty. "I've had time," she said. "And honestly, I'm not angry at Dominic. Or at you. I know that sounds strange." I said, "It does." She said, "Here's the truth. I knew by the second year of our marriage that I was living with someone who was never present enough for me to call it a real marriage. I chose to stay for my own reasons. Not because Dominic asked me to. Not because I had no choice. I had choices. I simply chose stability over the alternative." I said, "You don't owe me that explanation." She said, "I know. I'm giving it because I want you to understand the context." She paused. "I am not here to defend him. I am here because you are the one person in this entire situation that nobody asked. And that is the most wrong thing about all of it." I looked at her. "What is it you want to tell me about him?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Then she said it plainly. "Dominic Reyes has one fundamental problem that I lived with for 10 years and never solved. He cares about people deeply. But he shows that care by doing things rather than asking. He will arrange everything for you before you have had the chance to say what you want. He will solve your problem without asking whether you even wanted it solved. And he does all of this with the absolute certainty of someone who believes that if the outcome is good, the method does not matter." I said, "That is how he runs his operation, not just with people." She said, "Exactly. And in business, it works. But with real people in real relationships, it takes things apart slowly and invisibly until it is too late to see the damage." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "So you have the complete picture before you make any decision. I am not telling you to forgive him. I am not telling you to give him a chance. I am telling you to decide based on truth, not based on anger or on a principle you built before you had all the information." She looked at me steadily. "What you decide is entirely yours." She stood, put on her coat. Then she said one more thing. "Victor Salazar will try to reach you through your hospital. Do not meet with him alone." I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because my family has a history with him. I know how he moves." She left. I sat with my untouched coffee and watched her walk out the door. The woman Dominic walked away from had come here to make sure I had enough information to make the best decision for myself. No conditions, no agenda, just that. That kind of dignity does not have a language big enough to describe it. On Friday evening, I met Dominic at the coffee shop he suggested. He was already there. He was not wearing a suit, dark shirt, sleeves rolled up. He looked less like what people described him as, and more like what I remembered, which was unsettling in a quiet way. He said, "You met with Isabella." I said, "Yes." He said, "What did she tell you?" I said, "Things that mattered. And that stays between her and me. He nodded, did not ask again. That surprised me. We spent the next 40 minutes going through the Salazar situation in detail. Dominic explained it without performing, without hiding. The Salazar Foundation controlled parts of the pharmaceutical supply chain across 3 northeastern states through grant agreements. Legal, technically. Exploiting regulatory gaps. Dominic had been competing in the same space from the opposite direction for years, which was why Salazar wanted him gone. Dominic said, "His agreement with your hospital gives him legal access to your vendor lists, department schedules, and some anonymized patient data. Not enough for direct harm, enough to see patterns. Who works with whom? Who has contact with whom?" I said, "Who has contact with you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why didn't you handle Salazar before all of this?" He said, "I am handling him, slowly, through legal channels, building a case with proper evidence." He looked at me directly. "I don't handle problems the other way anymore. That changed about 8 years ago." I said, "You changed how you handle problems, but you never changed the habit of making decisions for other people." He said, "That is an accurate observation." I said, "Isabella said the same thing, different words." He said, "Isabella knows me better than most people ever have. No self-pity in it, just a fact." That is the saddest thing about those 10 years. The person who understood me best was the one I was never fully present with. I put down my cup. "What do you actually want from me, Dominic? Honestly?" He thought for a real moment, not calculating the right answer, actually considering it. He said, "I want a chance, not for you to forgive me or accept me, just a chance for you to see who I actually am, not who people say I am, not who I was on that street corner when we were kids." I said, "That is a fair thing to ask, but I am leaving Boston in 90 days. He said, "I know." I said, "That is not changing." He said, "I am not asking it to." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Then we have 90 days." He said, "All right." The first surprise of the 90 days was Salazar. He came to Boston General the following Tuesday with the Salazar Foundation. Completely legitimate, pre-scheduled, reviewing grant progress. My deputy director invited me to attend since my department was the largest recipient. I had done my research before he arrived. I was prepared. Victor Salazar at 56 looked like success wearing a suit to a professional meeting. Firm handshake, intelligent eyes, the conversational style of someone who has spent years learning to own a room without anyone noticing that is what he is doing. I sat through the meeting and did what I was trained to do. I participated on the surface and observed underneath. He asked more questions about me than about the project. Questions about my research schedule, my collaborators, my long-term plans. Reasonable enough that nobody else in the room caught it. Specific enough that I knew exactly what he was collecting. When the meeting ended and he shook my hand, he held it half a second too long. He said, "I hear you might be considering a new position. I hope Boston still holds some appeal." He knew about the Mayo Clinic. I kept my face completely neutral. I said, "Boston always has its own kind of appeal, Mr. Salazar." He left. I stood in the hallway and texted Dominic immediately. "Salazar just met with me. He knows about Mayo Clinic. We need to talk." His reply came in 30 seconds. "On my way. Meet at the coffee shop in 20 minutes." He moved fast when the situation required it. I noted the difference. Before, he had shown up at my hospital uninvited. Now he was responding to my request. That afternoon, Dominic confirmed that Salazar knowing about my plans was not an accident. His network had access to hospital administrative communications through the grant agreement. We started meeting regularly after that, not with any formal declaration. Just two people with overlapping concerns finding reasons to stay in contact, and then finding that the contact itself was becoming something. The second surprise of the 90 days was my mother. I went to visit Rosa Santos every weekend. She was 68, working through her second round of chemotherapy, and still the sharpest person I knew. She had raised me alone in that South Boston house after my father left, and she had never once let me see her bend under the weight of it. On a Sunday afternoon in September, I was sitting in her kitchen with coffee, and she said, "You've been hearing about Dominic Reyes." I said, "How did you hear?" She said, "Mrs. Ferreira from down the block. She still knows everything." She looked at me. "You didn't tell me." I said, "There was nothing to tell, Mom." She said, "There is, and I have something to tell you. I have been meaning to say it for a long time. There never seemed to be a right moment." What she told me shifted something in a way I was not ready for. In 2001, when I was in my second year of college and my mother was fighting alone to keep us in that house, a man came to the door. Not Dominic himself, someone who worked with him. The man brought an envelope. Inside was enough money to cover every outstanding bill and carry me through the rest of my degree without working 3 jobs at once. No conditions, no explanation, just the money and a handwritten note. For Rosa and Camilla, no strings, DR. My mother sent it back. She wrote one line on a piece of paper and returned it with the envelope. "We do not need this, and we do not owe you anything." Then she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "2 weeks after that, the provost at your school called and told you that you had been selected for the scholarship." I said, "That scholarship was real. I applied, I interviewed." She said, "The scholarship was real, but the person who cast the final deciding vote in the selection committee was connected to someone in Dominic's circle. I didn't find out until years later. A former neighbor told me." I sat very still. She said, "I think he learned that your scholarship was being blocked by someone on that committee who was being paid to favor a different candidate. And I think he made sure the right decision was made." I said, "He interfered in my scholarship." She said, "I'm not sure interfered is the right word. He may have corrected an interference that was already happening against you." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel grateful. I'm telling you because you deserve the complete picture before you decide anything." I looked at my mother. She had carried that knowledge for years, waiting for the moment when it would actually help me rather than just complicate things. That kind of patience is its own form of love. I texted Dominic that afternoon. "Need to talk, not about Salazar." When he arrived at the coffee shop and read my face, he understood this was a different kind of conversation. I said, "My mother told me about 2001. He did not look away. He asked, "How much did she tell you?" I said, "Enough. My scholarship." "Did you involve yourself?" He said, "I found out that the process was being blocked by a committee member who was being paid to favor another candidate. I resolved that." I said, "How?" He said, "That person received a better offer from another source and made a fairer decision." I said, "That is not a complete answer." He said, "It is the most complete answer I can give you here." I looked at him steadily. "You did not have my permission." He said, "You were 19 years old and working 3 jobs to stay in school. I did not ask for your permission." I said, "That is exactly the problem." He said, "I know." I said, "You do not see the contradiction? You say you stepped in because the process was being corrupted against me. But by stepping in without telling me, you were also removing my right to know what was happening in my own life." He said, "Yes, I see the contradiction. And if I were standing in that moment again, I would still do what I did. Because there was no way to explain the situation to you without pulling you into a world you had no business being in at 19. I was not willing to do that." I said, "But you were willing to decide that for me." He said simply, "Yes. That is how I operated. I see a problem and I fix it, and I do not ask anyone. It works in my business, and I carried it over to people. That was my worst mistake." That admission, plain and without any cushioning, sat between us like something physical. I was about to respond when his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and something changed in his face. Very slight. The kind of shift that only someone who had learned to read him would catch. I said, "What is it?" He looked up at me. He said, "Rosa Santos." Someone contacted your mother. Salazar's people. I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. We arrived at my mother's house within 25 minutes. Not together, I drove myself. Dominic arrived close behind. A woman my mother did not recognize had come to the door earlier that afternoon, claiming to be a hospital volunteer. In the course of a brief conversation, she had gently raised the question of whether Rosa knew the nature of the people her daughter had become involved with. My mother had sent her out immediately and called me. When Dominic walked through that door, Rosa Santos looked at him with the steady eyes of a woman who had watched the boys of that neighborhood grow up and become various things. Not softening, not hostility, just the patient, direct assessment of someone who had lived long enough not to rush. She said, "Dominic Reyes." He dipped his head slightly. He said, "Mrs. Santos." She said, "You got bigger since the last time I saw you." He said, "It's been 23 years, Mrs. Santos." She said, "I know. Sit down." I stood in the doorway and watched my mother invite Dominic Reyes to sit at her kitchen table. The same kitchen, the same smells, the same small windows looking into the backyard where she had grown tomatoes every summer for as long as I could remember. He sat with the ease of someone returning to a place they had not expected to be allowed back into. Rafe, who had come separately, stood near the back door and stayed quiet, which was unusual enough for him that both my mother and I noticed it. Dominic assessed the threat from Salazar's visit quickly. Physically low for now, a signal, not an attack. Salazar was showing me where he could reach if he decided to. He said, "I would like to arrange some protection for you, Mrs. Santos. Discreet. You will not see them, but they will be there." My mother looked at him. She said, "Are you asking me or telling me?" A brief pause. I watched Dominic. He said, "I am asking, ma'am." My mother said, "Better." She drank her tea. "Fine, but tell your people to stay out of my vegetable garden in the back." Rafe laughed out loud. A real laugh, genuine, not performed. Dominic looked at his brother. Just a look. Rafe composed himself. My mother looked at Rafe. She said, "You're his brother?" Rafe said, "Yes, ma'am, Raphael." She said, "You look more like your father than he does." Rafe said, "Thank you, ma'am. I think that's a compliment." She said, "Depends on what you think about your father." Rafe grinned. He said, "That is the best answer I have heard all day." After my mother went to rest, Dominic and I sat alone in the kitchen, the evening light coming through those small windows, the smell of coffee she had made for us before she excused herself. I said, "My mother likes you." He said, "She doesn't trust me, that's different." I said, "She invited you to sit at her table. People she doesn't trust get the doorstep." He looked around the kitchen slowly, taking in details. The white cabinet, same paint it had always been. The framed photo from my medical school graduation hung beside a small cross on the wall. The parish calendar from the church 2 blocks over. He said, "I have not been inside a house like this in 20 years. I said, "A house like this meaning what?" He said, "A house that belongs to real people." He did not mean wealth or the lack of it. He meant something else. Something about what gets left behind when a person becomes a certain kind of powerful. Something he recognized was missing. The following days had a different texture. We started meeting without it needing a crisis to justify it. Wednesday evenings at the coffee shop. Occasionally he would come with documents related to the community clinic he was building in East Boston, and we would go through medical protocol decisions that genuinely needed my input. Other times we talked with no agenda at all. One Wednesday he brought me out to see the clinic itself. Not blueprints, the actual physical space being constructed in East Boston. The clinic was designed to serve people with no insurance, immigrants, low-wage workers, people who fell through the gaps. 5 exam rooms, 2 basic lab spaces, a waiting room large enough to feel like a real place rather than a holding area. I walked through the rooms and noticed the details that only someone in my field would catch. The equipment was not the cheapest available, but was not wasteful either. The lighting was adequate for careful work without being harsh. The waiting room had real chairs. There was a corner set up for children with toys in a small bin. I said, "Who designed the space?" He said, "I worked with an architect, but the specific requirements were mine." I said, "The chairs in the waiting room." He said, "People coming here already have enough reasons to feel diminished. Decent seating is not a luxury." I stood in the middle of that construction space and looked at him. Dust on his jacket, hands in his pockets, completely at ease. This was the Dominic Reyes that nobody in his world knew existed. I said, "90 days will not be enough time to understand you fully." He said, "I know." I said, "I am going to Mayo Clinic on schedule." He said, "I know." I said, "But 90 days is a starting point, not an ending point. If this is worth continuing, it will find a way to continue." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "The doctor's approach. Diagnose before you treat." I said, "The approach of someone who learned expensive lessons about skipping that step." We stayed in the clinic for another hour, walking through each room, discussing what would happen there. And somewhere in that conversation, I stopped thinking of him as the complicated situation I had walked into and started thinking of him as a person I was genuinely learning to know. That shift was quiet and significant, and I did not announce it. Salazar moved on a Monday morning. 3 things simultaneously, which told me he had been planning this for a while. The first was an article on a small local business news site. Vague enough to be legally safe, specific enough that the right people knew exactly who was being discussed. Questions about the ties between a new community clinic's medical advisor and, as they put it, a controversial figure in the Boston business community. The second was an anonymous complaint filed with the Massachusetts Medical Board. Alleged conflict of professional interest involving Dr. Camila Santos. No real evidence, but enough to trigger a preliminary administrative review. Harmless in the long run, a significant disruption in the short term. The third was what I cared about most. My mother was at Boston General for her chemotherapy session that day. She was moved to a different room for administrative reasons. A new aide was assigned who did not know her protocols. Small adjustments to her care that no one could prove were intentional, but enough to create anxiety and confusion for a 68-year-old woman already going through something hard. I heard about all 3 things before 10 in the morning. I called Dominic. I said, "Salazar is moving, 3 fronts at once." He said, "I know. I heard an hour ago." His voice was the same volume, but something in it had shifted into a very focused register. This is his standard approach. Nothing large enough to be sued for individually. Everything combined large enough to cause real damage. I said, "My mother." He said, "Being handled. My people are already at the hospital." There was a pause. Then I said, "Did you ask me first?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Camila, your mother is in that hospital being placed in an unsafe situation." I said, "I know. And I am asking whether you asked me first." A longer pause. He said, "No, I acted." I said, "This time I understand why. But I need you to understand that I want to know, even after the fact, even when you have already moved." He said, "All right, no argument." And then he told me. The room had been corrected. Her usual aide was coming back by afternoon. 2 of his people were stationed discreetly in the wing. I said, "Thank you, and thank you for acting before asking this time. It was right." He said, "I am learning, slowly." I called Nora after that, not to update her on everything, just to hear a voice from outside all of it. She listened to a summary. Then she said, "Do you want my honest opinion?" I said yes. She said, "You are waiting for the next hit before you can make a decision. But you have already made your decisions. Mayo Clinic, 90 days. Salazar does not change either of those. So what are you actually worried about?" I said, "I am worried I am letting myself get pulled into Dominic's story in a way I cannot control." She said, "Mila, you were in his story the moment he filed those papers. That is done. The question is not whether you are in it. The question is whether you are a passive character or someone making active choices. I looked out my office window. I said, I do not want to be anyone's character but my own. She said, then don't be. But you have your own story. Dominic is in it. That is different from you being in his. You know the difference. I was quiet for a moment. She said, you should charge for this. I said, you absolutely should. Later that week, Salazar pushed further. He requested a formal meeting with hospital administration to review the grant agreement in light of, as he framed it, questions about the professional integrity of certain physicians. I was asked to attend. I went. Not out of fear, because this was my environment and I was not giving it to anyone. He presented his concerns smoothly, deniable, professional, credible enough that the administrators in the room had to sit up and listen. When he finished, I spoke. I said, Mr. Salazar, the article you are referencing was published by an outlet with no documented fact-checking standards. The anonymous complaint you are referencing is currently in preliminary review and per standard process will produce no finding for at least 90 days. I will not be in Boston during those 90 days because I accepted a position at the Mayo Clinic which this administration has known about for 3 weeks. He started to speak. I continued. I also note that the Salazar Foundation signed its grant agreement with this hospital 3 weeks before I became a subject of concern. The timing is worth acknowledging. I looked at the board members. I have nothing to hide. Every outside engagement I have taken has been properly disclosed and is fully verifiable. If the board wants to review any of it, I will provide everything. I suggest we end this meeting here. A board member who had known my work for a decade nodded. I agree. Salazar left with the flat expression of someone already calculating the next move. I stood in the hallway afterward and breathed. My heart was running slightly faster than normal, not fear, the adrenaline of a handled situation. I texted Dominic. Finished the meeting with Salazar. He got nothing, but he will try again. His reply was immediate. I know he will. He will move more directly next time. We need to talk tonight. I have something to tell you. That evening at the coffee shop, Dominic told me what he had been building for 3 years. He said, I have a case against Salazar. Evidence of pharmaceutical supply chain fraud across 3 states. Enough to take simultaneously to the FBI, the DEA, and the Massachusetts Attorney General. I said, why haven't you moved before now? He said, because I needed a final trigger, something Salazar did publicly enough that no one could claim I manufactured it. What he did today at your hospital, in front of your board, with witnesses present, that is the trigger. I looked at him. I said, you have had this ready for 3 years. He said, yes. I said, and I was not part of the plan. He said, no. He met my eyes without looking away. You are what happened outside the plan. That does not make you any less real. That sentence, plain and undecorated. I said, is there anything I can do? The question surprised him. Not that I asked it, but the way I asked it. Like someone wanting to contribute, not someone asking permission. He said, yes, if you are willing. The pharmaceutical supply chain records from Boston General over the past 2 years. You have access as department chief. If you can confirm what I believe is in those records. I said, systematic diversion data. He said, yes. I said, I found that 2 years ago. I reported it. No one did anything. He said, because they were afraid of Salazar. I said, this time is different. He said, this time is different. I said, I will go through the records tonight. I worked until 2 in the morning. 2 years ago, when I first found the anomalies in the hospital's supply chain, I had done what good doctors do when they encounter something that does not add up. I documented everything. Dates, lot numbers, discrepancies, every report I submitted, every written acknowledgement I received, every instance where the issue was quietly buried. Not because I knew I would need it someday, just because that is how I work. That documentation, combined with the records Dominic had built from the other side of the same supply chain across 3 states, produce something that neither set of evidence could achieve alone. A complete picture. I sent the files to Dominic at 2:17 in the morning. I added a note. I believe this is what you need. The technical medical analysis begins on page 12. I can walk your attorneys through it if necessary. His reply came at 2:23. This is more than enough. Thank you. Then a second message 30 seconds later. Go to sleep, doctor. I read that and laughed. Actually laughed. Genuine, small, the kind that happens when something catches you off guard in the best possible way. I typed back, already sleeping, at my desk. He replied, that is not sleeping. Go home. I went home, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I slept a full night. 72 hours later, Victor Salazar was arrested. Not by one agency, by 3 simultaneously. The FBI, the DEA, and the Massachusetts Attorney General's inspector arrived at his office at 7:30 in the morning before his assistant had come in. No tactical entry, no dramatic scene. 3 men and 2 women in plain clothes, with valid arrest warrants and 3 years of evidence. Nora saw it on social media before the major news outlets ran the story. She called me before I had reached the hospital. She read the headline out loud. Victor Salazar arrested on federal pharmaceutical supply chain fraud charges. Investigation spanning 3 years. Then she said, Mila, is this connected to what? I said, I will explain everything, soon, I promise. I called Dominic. He answered before the second ring. I said, it is out. He said, yes. I said, are you all right? A brief pause. The pause of a man who is not accustomed to being asked that question first. He said, fine. Are you? I said, I am fine. I looked out my window at the morning coming up over the city. What happens now? He said, now we continue with what needs doing. I said, the clinic. He said, the clinic, and other things. That phrase, other things, hung in the air between us. We both knew what it meant. Neither of us said it yet. I said, coffee this afternoon? He said, I will be there. That afternoon was different from every meeting we had before it. There was no crisis to navigate, no Salazar to manage, no legal situation requiring our combined attention. Just 2 cups of coffee and 2 people who had been orbiting something for months and were finally willing to look directly at it. I put the question flat on the table. I said, did you leave Isabella because of me, or because you had wanted to leave for a long time? He looked at me without flinching. He said, both, but in a way that did not answer itself until I heard your name. I said, explain. He said, I had known for years that the marriage was hollow. But knowing and acting are 2 different things when the cost of acting is high. I chose stability. I said, and when I came back to Boston? He said, I realized I had been using stability as a reason to avoid the real question, which was how I wanted to live the rest of my life. I said, that question had nothing to do with me. He said, correct. But hearing your name was what made me ask it. You were the reason I finally asked, not the reason I answered it the way I did. There is a difference. I said, that distinction. I understand it now. I didn't at the start. He said, I know. I said, because you didn't say it clearly at the start. He said, I did not know how to say it clearly then. I said, and now? He said, now I am learning. He looked at me. Not always well, not always on time. I said, but you are learning. He said, yes. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then I said, Dominic, I am going to Rochester in 3 weeks. He said, I know. I said, and I do not know what comes after. He said, neither do I. I said, is that all right with you? He thought before answering. This had been changing in him across the weeks. He was beginning to actually think before responding rather than answering from old habit. He said, not entirely, but I understand why you need it that way. and I do not have the right to ask you to change your plans because I am uncomfortable. I said, "That is the most mature thing you have said to me." He said, "I am working on it." I put down my cup. I said, "Rochester is a 2-hour flight from Boston." He looked at me. I said, "That is not an impossible distance." He said, "No." I said, "I am not making any promises." He said, "I am not asking for any." I said, "But I am not closing the door." He looked at me for a long moment, and what I saw in his eyes was something I had not seen there before. Not control, not the careful management of someone who had kept people at a distance for 25 years. Something simpler and more honest. Real hope. He said, "All right." Just that. One word. And it was enough. That same evening, Isabella called me, not to meet in person, just a call. She said, "You helped take down Salazar, I heard." I said, "He earned it." She said, "Yes." A beat. "I want you to know that I think this is the first time Dominic has done the right thing in the right way without causing unnecessary damage to people who did not deserve it." I said, "He learns slowly." She said, "He is learning." Something warm in her voice, quiet and real. That is something I was never able to accomplish in 10 years, not because I did not try, because he was not ready. I said, "Thank you, Isabella." She said, "Good luck in Minnesota." I set down the phone and looked at the Charles River through my window, the city lights moving on the water. The woman he walked away from had just called to wish me well. There are forms of dignity that no language fully covers. The last 3 weeks in Boston had a specific quality to them, not dramatic, not heavy. Just ordinary things done with more attention than usual, because I knew they were ending. My mother finished her final chemotherapy session. Results were good, doctors were optimistic, and we sat in her kitchen that Sunday afternoon and ate the flan she had made herself to mark the occasion. I looked at her across the table and realized this was the first time in 3 months I was not carrying a low-level current of anxiety in my chest. I was just there, present in the room. That felt like something. Dominic came to visit my mother once more, not because of any emergency. He asked me if it was all right, and I said yes. I was not in the room for most of it. I came in from the back garden at one point and found the two of them at the kitchen table talking about people from the old neighborhood, names I half recognized from childhood. There was ease in it. They did not need me as the bridge between them. That also felt like something. Nora organized a small dinner for me the Thursday before I left. 4 of our closest colleagues, the Italian place we all knew, no speeches. Nora simply said at the end of the night, "You are going to be extraordinary in Rochester, and you are going to call me every week, or I will drive there myself." I said, "Deal." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You deserve to be happy, Mila. Not conditionally, just happy." I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do." I also met Marco one last time. I owed him honesty, and I had not been fully honest. I had been fair but not complete. Over coffee, I told him there was someone in my life more complicated than I had been letting on. Not everything. Enough. He listened without cutting me off. He said, "You're telling me this because you think I deserve to know." I said, "Because you have been kind and patient and you do deserve to know." He said, "I appreciate it. Don't apologize. You didn't know sooner. You know now. That is what you can control." We said goodbye with civility. Not friends exactly, not strangers either. Two people who were not meant for each other, but who treated each other decently while they shared a small corner of the same city. That matters, even if it is quiet. The night before I left, I went to Dominic's house. Not because anyone asked me to, because I wanted to. For the first time, that was the only reason. Elena opened the door. She looked at me with the quiet expression of someone who has understood everything for a long time and feels no need to say so. She said, "Mr. Dominic is in the kitchen." The kitchen, of course. He was making coffee. At 9 in the evening, which neither of us was going to address. He said, "You came. Not surprise. Certainty." I sat at the table. He put a cup in front of me without asking. The habit of weeks. A small thing built slowly. The kind of thing you cannot buy or rush. I said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Ask." I said, "The scholarship in 2001. If you could go back, would you do it differently?" He thought. Actually thought. He said, "I would find a way to tell you first." I said, "Even if that meant pulling me into a world you didn't want me in at 19? He said, "Even then, because it was your decision, not mine." I looked at him. I said, "That is the right answer." He said, "I came to it slowly." I said, "But you came to it." We stayed until nearly midnight. The coffee went cold. The conversation moved without any particular direction. The clinic, my mother, the streets of South Boston, we both still carry somewhere inside us. Not important conversations as the world measures importance. Just two people learning how to talk to each other without an agenda driving it. When I stood to leave, he stood too, just courtesy, not to stop me. At the door, I turned back. I said, "Dominic." He said, "What?" I said, "I am glad you were honest with Isabella when she asked. I am glad you gave her a fair settlement instead of fighting it. Those are small things, but they say something about who you are choosing to be." He looked at me. "You're saying I'm not entirely a lost cause." I said, "I am saying you are trying." Rochester, Minnesota in October is a different kind of cold than Boston. Cleaner, quieter. The sky at night is actually dark, which you stop noticing as a possibility when you have lived in a big city long enough. 6 weeks in, I had found my rhythm. A new apartment with large windows and light that was better than I expected. A department at Mayo Clinic that was exactly as demanding as its reputation, in the best possible way. Colleagues I was learning to trust at the pace that trust actually requires, which is slow. And the phone calls, 3 times a week. No formal schedule, no rule about it. Just a pattern that formed the way these things form when two people find that the only remaining space in a full day lands at around the same time. For me, that was 9:30 in the evening Rochester time, which meant 10:30 in Boston. Some calls were about work. The community clinic was set to open officially in November, and I was joining some of the medical protocol discussions remotely, which was the consulting arrangement we had formalized. Some calls were about my mother, who was recovering well and had apparently started baking new things specifically to have something to bring when Dominic came to visit. I heard this and did not know exactly what to feel about my mother and Dominic building a friendship that did not require me in the middle of it. What I felt, once I sat with it, was something close to relief. Some calls were about nothing in particular. Recapping the day, asking about the other persons, a form of presence across a 2-hour flight. One evening, he asked, "How was surgery today?" I said, "First case was difficult. Second and third were routine. Last one was an 8-year-old. Pediatric neurology is a different world from adult work. I am still adjusting." He said, "You're worried about that." I said, "Yes, but the right kind of worried." He said, "What is the right kind of worried?" I said, "The kind that makes you pay closer attention instead of the kind that shuts you down." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've never heard it framed that way." I said, "Another time I will explain more." "What are you doing?" He said, "Reviewing a design issue with exam room 3 of the clinic. Ventilation problem." I said, "Call Marco Silva." He said, "What?" I said, "He is a civil engineer, the best in Boston for medical facility construction. He is a decent person and there is no drama attached to the situation. The clinic serves 200 patients a week. The ventilation matters more than your feelings about the history." A long pause, then the sound of a slow exhale. He said, "Fine. I will contact him." I said, "Good." He said, "You know you are testing me." I said, "I know you are learning not to let your ego make decisions that your judgment should be making." A beat. Did you pass? The quality of his voice shifted in a way that was not irritation. Warmer than that, less controlled. He said, "You're smiling right now." I said, "I am not smiling." He said, "You are smiling." I said, "Maybe a little." 8 weeks after I moved to Rochester, Dominic flew in on a Friday evening. No elaborate plan. I had texted that I was free over the weekend. He had replied in 30 seconds asking if a Friday evening flight worked. I said yes. He arrived with a small bag. Not too little, not too much. Leaving the length of the stay for me to shape. That, still, was new for him. Leaving things for me to decide. But he did it. I took him to a neighborhood restaurant downtown. Good food, comfortable noise level, conversation that did not have to be formal. After dinner, we walked through the city center. Rochester in October. Cool air, the smell of leaves, a sky clear enough that you could actually see the stars. He said, "Rochester is smaller than I expected." I said, "Small but good." He said, "You like it here." I said, "I like the work here." I paused for a moment. "And I like having space to think. Boston didn't give me much of that." He said, "Too much history in Boston." I said, "Too much happening at once, not necessarily bad, just a lot." We walked quietly for a while. I thought about the last 5 months. The morning Nora called me in the break room, the letter I sent to Mayo Clinic, my mother's kitchen, Isabella's quiet dignity, Rafe's sideways honesty, Dominic in a hospital hallway for 2 hours because it was the only option he had left. All of it led here, to this street in a small Midwestern city on a clear October night. He said, "Do you know what I have realized?" I said, "What?" He said, "I thought the biggest thing I ever did was leaving Isabella for you. I thought that showed something real." I said, "And?" He said, "It showed that I was still making decisions alone, in my own way. Not for you. Not truly." He kept walking, looking ahead. He said, "What actually shows something? Is sitting on the phone listening to you describe a difficult surgery and asking the right questions afterward? Is calling Marco Silva and asking for his help even when every instinct I have is against it? Is flying to Rochester on a Friday night with no plan because I do not know what you want and I am finally willing to ask instead of decide?" I stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to look at me. I said, "What do you want? Just say it directly." He looked at me. He said, "I want to see where this actually goes, not the version I mapped out in my head in advance. The real one, wherever that leads." I said, "And if it doesn't lead anywhere?" He said, "Then at least we were honest about it the whole way through." I stood on that street in Rochester and looked at the man in front of me, a man who had spent 44 years learning to stop making decisions for other people and was now standing in a city he did not know, at night, with no plan, having just said exactly what he wanted without dressing it up or strategizing around it. I said, "That is the best answer you could give." He said, "I know." We started walking again. I thought about a question I am asked sometimes by people who hear pieces of this story. They ask why I walked away in 24 hours. They ask if I didn't feel anything. I felt everything, more than I ever said out loud. But feeling something and acting from that feeling without thinking are two different things. That is the most important lesson 15 years in operating rooms gave me, and I carry it into every part of my life. I walked away not because I did not care. I walked away because I refused to be anyone's justification. Refused to be the reason someone rewrites their life without asking whether I want to be part of that rewrite. And I walked away because I respect myself enough to know that a relationship started with an imposed decision will continue that way, unless something genuinely changes. What changed, across 90 days, was not dramatic. It was not a single moment. It was a series of small choices, made repeatedly. Dominic accepted my conditions when I set them. He stopped calling when I asked. He texted before showing up. He asked my mother permission before arranging her protection. He called Marco Silva. He flew to Rochester with no plan and no agenda other than asking. Those are small things. But small things are where character actually lives. My mother is recovering. She bakes on Sundays and saves things to bring when Dominic visits her on the third Thursday of every month, which is a schedule that formed between the two of them without my involvement. Rafe sends me messages occasionally, usually terrible jokes about Boston weather, occasionally something real. Nora calls every Sunday. We talk for an hour. She does not need to say she is my anchor because she already knows she is. And on Wednesday and Friday evenings, someone flies in from Boston. Or I fly the other direction. Not the end of a story, just the beginning of the next chapter. And this time we are writing it together. One question at a time. One honest conversation at a time. One small choice at a time. The most dangerous thing you can do to a powerful man is not fear him and not fight him. It is simply not need him. And the most surprising thing that can happen after that, if he is the right kind of man, is that he finally learns to ask. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
Before we close this story, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because this one carries something worth keeping. On the surface, this looks like a story about a powerful man who made a dramatic choice. He threw away a 10-year marriage. He reached back towards someone from a life he had long since left behind, and she walked away in 24 hours. But that is not what this story is actually about. This story is about the difference between power and wisdom, and why so many people who have one never find the other. Dominic Reyes had everything the world measures success by. He had control. He had resources. He had a reputation that made federal agencies nervous. And yet the most important lesson of his life came not from any enemy he faced, not from any deal he closed, not from any crisis he survived. It came from a woman who simply refused to be decided for. That is the first lesson. Making a decision for someone else, even with the best intention, is still taking something from them. It is still saying, quietly, that your judgment matters more than their voice. In business, that might be leadership. In a relationship, in a family, in any space where another person's dignity is involved, it is a form of taking. And people feel it, even when they cannot name it. The second lesson lives in Isabella. She is not the villain of this story. She never was. She is the portrait of what it looks like to act from your own values when the situation gives you every reason not to. She was hurt. She had every right to make things difficult. Instead, she walked away with her head up, and she even reached out to make sure the other woman had the full truth before she decided anything. That is not weakness. That is a kind of strength most people never develop, because it asks nothing in return. The third lesson is the quietest one, and I think it is the most important. Real change does not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives as a series of small choices, repeated over time, until they become who you are. Dominic did not change because of one conversation or one confrontation. He changed because he kept choosing differently, one situation at a time, even when it was uncomfortable, even when his instincts pushed the other way. Small choices, repeated. That is where character is actually built. You can be the most powerful person in any room, but if you never learn to ask, you will spend your whole life building things that feel hollow at the center. The real first move was never the divorce. The real first move was finally learning to ask.